The corpses were as we left them, one neatly set in the coffin as if an undertaker had already attended her, the other in her chair at the table. Lestat brushed past them as if he didn't see them, while I watched him in fascination. The candles had all burned down, and the only light was that of the moon and the street. I could see his iced and gleaming profile as he set the child down on the pillow. "Come here, Louis. You haven't fed enough. I know you haven't," he said with that same calm, convincing voice he had used skillfully all evening. He held my hand in his own warm and tight. "See her, Louis. How plump and sweet she looks, as if even death can't take her freshness. The will to live is too strong. He might make a sculpture of her tiny lips and rounded hands, but he cannot make her fade. You remember the way you wanted her when you saw her in that room." I resisted him. I didn't want to kill her. I hadn't wanted to last night. And then suddenly I remembered two conflicting things and was torn in agony. I remembered the powerful beating of her heart against mine, and I hungered for it. Hungered for it so badly I turned my back on her in the bed and would have rushed out of the room had not Lestat held me fast. I remembered her mother's face, and that moment of horror when I dropped the child and he'd come into the room. But he wasn't mocking me now. He was confusing me. "You want her, Louis. Don't you see? Once you've taken her, then you can take whomever you wish. You wanted her last night, but you weakened, and that's why she's not dead." I could feel it was true, what he said. I could feel again that ecstasy of being pressed to her, her little heart going and going. "She's too strong for me. Her heart, it wouldn't give up," I said to him. "Is she so strong?" He smiled. He drew me close to him. "Take her, Louis. I know you want her." And I did. I drew close to the bed now and just watched her, her chest barely moving with her breath, and one small hand was tangled in her long gold hair. I couldn't bear it. Looking at her, wanting her not to die, and wanting her, and the more I looked at her, the more I could taste her skin, feel my arm sliding under her back and pulling her up to me, feel her soft neck. Soft, soft, that's what she was, so soft. I tried to tell myself it was best for her to die, but what was to become of her? But these were lying thoughts. I wanted her, and so I took her in my arms and held her, her burning cheek on mine, her hair falling down over my wrists and brushing my eyelids, the sweet perfume of a child, strong and pulsing in spite of sickness and death. She moaned now, stirred in her sleep, and that was more than I could bear. I'd kill her before I'd let her wake and know it. I went into her throat and heard Lestat saying to me strangely, "Just a little tear. It's just a little throat." And I obeyed him. I won't tell you again what it was like, except that it caught me up just as it had done before, and as killing always does, only more, so that my knees bent and I half lay on the bed sucking her dry, that heart pounding again, that would not slow, would not give up. And suddenly, as I went on and on, the instinctual part of me waiting for the slowing of the heart which would mean death, Lestat wrenched me from her. "But she's not dead," I whispered. But it was over. The furniture of the room emerged from the darkness. I sat stunned, staring at her, too weak to move, my head rolling back against the headboard of the bed, my hands pressing down on the velvet spread. Lestat was snatching her up, talking to her, saying a name. "Claudia, Claudia, listen to me. Come round, Claudia." He was carrying her now out of the bedroom into the parlour, and his voice was so soft I barely heard him. "You're ill, do you hear me? You must do as I tell you to get well." And then, in the pause that followed, I came to my senses. I realized what he was doing, that he had cut his wrist and given it to her, and she was drinking. "That's it, dear. More," he was saying to her. "You must drink it to get well." "Damn you!" I shouted, and he hissed at me with blazing eyes. He sat on the settee with her locked to his wrist. I saw her white hand clutching at his sleeve, and I could see his chest heaving for breath, and his face contorted the way I'd never seen it. He let out a moan and whispered again to her to go on, and when I moved from the threshold he glared at me again, as if to say, "I'll kill you." "But why, Lestat?" I whispered to him. He was trying now to push her off, and she wouldn't let go. With her fingers locked around his fingers and arm, she held the wrist to her mouth, a growl coming out of her. "Stop, stop," he said to her. He was clearly in pain. He pulled back from her and held her shoulders with both hands. She tried desperately to reach his wrist with her teeth, but she couldn't, and then she looked at him with the most innocent astonishment. He stood back, his hand out lest she move. Then he clapped a handkerchief to his wrist and backed away from her, towards the bell rope. He pulled it sharply, his eyes still fixed on her. "What have you done, Lestat?" I asked him. "What have you done?" I stared at her. She sat composed, revived, filled with life, no sign of pallor or weakness in her. Her legs stretched out straight on the damask, her white gown soft and thin like an angel's gown around her small form. She was looking at Lestat. "Not me," he said to her. "Ever again. Do you understand? But I'll show you what to do." When I tried to make him look at me and answer me as to what he was doing, he shook me off. He gave me such a blow with his arm that I hit the wall. Someone was knocking now. I knew what he meant to do. Once more I tried to reach out for him, but he spun so fast I didn't even see him hit me. When I did see him, I was sprawled in the chair and he was opening the door. "Yes, come in, please. There's been an accident," he said to the young slave boy, and then, shutting the door, he took him from behind, so that the boy never knew what happened. And even as he knelt over the body, drinking, he beckoned for the child, who slid from the couch and went down on her knees and took the wrist offered her, quickly pushing back the cuff of the shirt. She gnawed first, as if she meant to devour his flesh, and then Lestat showed her what to do. He sat back and let her have the rest, his eye on the boy's chest, so that when the time came, he bent forward and said, "No more. He's dying. You must never drink after the heart stops, or you'll be sick again. Sick to death. Do you understand?" But she'd had enough, and she sat next to him, their backs against the legs of the settee, their legs stretched out on the floor. The boy died in seconds. I felt weary and sickened, as if the night had lasted 1,000 years. I sat there watching them, the child drawing close to Lestat now, snuggling near him as he slipped his arm around her, though his indifferent eyes remained fixed on the corpse. Then he looked up at me. "Where is Mamma?" asked the child softly. She had a voice equal to her physical beauty, clear like a little silver bell. It was sensual. She was sensual. Her eyes were as wide and clear as Babette's. You understand that I was barely aware of what all this meant. I knew what it might mean, but I was aghast. Now Lestat stood up and scooped her from the floor and came towards me. "She's our daughter," he said. "You're going to live with us now." He beamed at her, but his eyes were cold, as if it were all a horrible joke. Then he looked at me, and his face had conviction. He pushed her towards me, and I found her on my lap, my arms around her, feeling again how soft she was, how plump her skin was, like the skin of a warm fruit, Plums warmed by sunlight, her huge luminescent eyes were fixed on me with trusting curiosity. "This is Louis, and I am Lestat," he said to her, dropping down beside me. She looked about and said that it was a pretty room, very pretty, but she wanted her mamma. He had his comb out and was running it through her hair, holding the locks so as to not pull with the comb. Her hair was untangling and becoming like satin. She was the most beautiful child I'd ever seen, and now she glowed with the cold fire of a vampire. Her eyes were a woman's eyes. I could see it already. She would become white and spare like us, but not lose her shape. I understood now what Lestat had said about death, what he meant. I touched her neck where the 2 red puncture wounds were bleeding just a little. I took Lestat's handkerchief from the floor and touched it to her neck. "Your mamma's left you with us. She wants you to be happy," he was saying with the same immeasurable confidence. "She knows we can make you very happy." "I want some more," she said, turning to the corpse on the floor. "No, not tonight. Tomorrow night," said Lestat, and he went to take the lady out of his coffin. The child slid off my lap, and I followed her. She stood watching as Lestat put the 2 ladies and the slave boy into the bed. He brought the covers up to their chins. "Are they sick?" asked the child. "Yes, Claudia," he said. "They're sick, and they're dead. You see, they die when we drink from them." He came towards her and swung her up into his arms again. We stood there with her between us. I was mesmerized by her transformed, by her every gesture. She was not a child any longer. She was a vampire child. "Now, Louis was going to leave us," said Lestat, his eyes moving from my face to hers. "He was going to go away, but now he's not, because he wants to stay and take care of you and make you happy." He looked at me. "You're not going to go, are you, Louis?" "You bastard," I whispered to him. "You fiend." "Such language in front of your daughter," he said. "I'm not your daughter," she said with a silvery voice. "I'm my mamma's daughter." "No, dear, not any more," he said to her. He glanced at the window, and then he shut the bedroom door behind us and turned the key in the lock. "You're our daughter, Louis's daughter and my daughter, do you see? Now, whom should you sleep with, Louis or me?" And then, looking at me, he said, "Perhaps you should sleep with Louis. After all, when I'm tired, I'm not so kind." The vampire stopped. The boys said nothing. A child vampire," he whispered finally. The vampire glanced up suddenly as though startled, though his body made no movement. He glared at the tape recorder as if it were something monstrous. The boy saw that the tape was almost out. Quickly he opened his briefcase and drew out a new cassette, clumsily fitting it into place. He looked at the vampire as he pressed the record button. The vampire's face looked weary, drawn, his cheekbones more prominent and his brilliant green eyes enormous. They had begun at dark, which had come early on this San Francisco winter night, and now it was just before 10 p.m. The vampire straightened and smiled and said calmly, "We are ready to go on?" "He'd done this to the little girl just to keep you with him?" asked the boy. "That is difficult to say. It was a statement. I'm convinced that Lestat was a person who pretended not to think or talk about his motives or beliefs, even to himself. One of those people who must act. Such a person must be pushed considerably before he will open up and confess that there is method and thought to the way he lives. That is what had happened that night with Lestat. He'd been pushed to where he had discovered even for himself why he lived as he did. Keeping me with him, that was undoubtedly part of what pushed him. But I think, in retrospect, that he himself wanted to know his own reasons for killing, wanted to examine his own life. He was discovering when he spoke what he did believe. But he did indeed want me to remain. He lived with me in a way he could never have lived alone, and as I have told you, I was careful never to sign any property over to him, which maddened him, that he could not persuade me to do. The vampire laughed suddenly. Look at all the other things he persuaded me to do. How strange. He could persuade me to kill a child, but not to part with my money. He shook his head. But, he said, it wasn't greed, really. As you can see, it was fear of him that made me tight with him. You speak of him as if he were dead. You say Lestat was this or was that. Is he dead? Asked the boy. I don't know, said the vampire. I think perhaps he is, but I'll come to that. We were talking of Claudia, weren't we? There was something else I wanted to say about Lestat's motives that night. Lestat trusted no one, as you see. He was like a cat, by his own admission, a lone predator. Yet he had communicated with me that night. He had, to some extent, exposed himself simply by telling the truth. He had dropped his mockery, his condescension. He had forgotten his perpetual anger for just a little while, and this for Lestat was exposure. When we stood alone in that dark street, I felt in him a communion with another I hadn't felt since I died. I rather think that he ushered Claudia into vampirism for revenge. Revenge not only on you, but on the world, suggested the boy. Yes, as I said, Lestat's motives for everything revolved around revenge. Was it all started with the father, with the school? I don't know. I doubt it, said the vampire. But I want to go on. Oh, please, go on. You have to go on. I mean, it's only 10 o'clock. The boy showed his watch. The vampire looked at it, and then he smiled at the boy. The boy's face changed. It went black as if from some sort of shock. Are you still afraid of me? Asked the vampire. The boy said nothing, but he shrank slightly from the edge of the table. His body elongated. His feet moved out over the bare boards and then contracted. I should think you'd be very foolish if you weren't, said the vampire. But don't be. Shall we go on? Please, said the boy. He gestured towards the machine. Well, the vampire began, our life was much changed with Mademoiselle Claudia, as you can imagine. Her body died, yet her senses awakened much as mine had, and I treasured in her the signs of this. But I was not aware for quite a few days how much I wanted her, wanted to talk with her and be with her. At first I thought only of protecting her from Lestat. I gathered her into my coffin every morning, and would not let her out of my sight with him if possible. This was what Lestat wanted, and he gave little suggestions that he might do her harm. A starving child is a frightful sight, he said to me. A starving vampire even worse. They'd hear her screams in Paris, he said. Were we to lock her away to die? But all this was meant for me, to draw me close and keep me there. Afraid of fleeing alone, I could not conceive of risking it with Claudia. She was a child. She needed care. And there was much pleasure in caring for her. She forgot her 5 years of mortal life at once, or so it seemed, for she was mysteriously quiet. And from time to time I even feared that she had lost all sense, that the illness of her mortal life, combined with the great vampire shock, might have robbed her of reason. But this proved hardly the case. She was simply unlike Lestat, and me to such. She was simply unlike Lestat and me to such an extent I couldn't comprehend her. For little child she was, but also fierce killer, now capable of the ruthless pursuit of blood with all a child's demanding. And though Lestat still threatened me with danger to her, he did not threaten her at all, but was loving to her, proud of her beauty, anxious to teach her that we must kill to live, and that we ourselves could never die. The plague raged in the city then, as I've indicated, and he took her to the stinking cemeteries where the yellow fever and plague victims lay in heaps, while the sounds of shovels never ceased all through the day and night. "This is death," he told her, pointing to the decaying corpse of a woman, "which we cannot suffer. Our bodies will stay always as they are, fresh and alive, but we must never hesitate to bring death, because it is how we live." And Claudia gazed on this with inscrutable liquid eyes. If there was not understanding in the early years, there was no smattering of fear. Mute and beautiful, she played with dolls, dressing, undressing them by the hour. Mute and beautiful she killed. And I, transformed by Lestat's instruction, was now to seek out humans in much greater numbers. But it was not only the killing of them that soothed some pain in me which had been constant in the dark, still nights on Point du Lac. When I sat with only the company of Lestat and the old man, it was then great, shifting numbers everywhere in the streets, which never grew quiet, cabarets which never shut their doors, balls which lasted till dawn, the music and laughter streaming out of the open windows, people all around me now, my pulsing victims, not seen with that great love I'd felt for my sister and Babette, but with some new detachment and need. And I did kill them. Kills infinitely varied and great distances apart, as I walked with the vampire's sight and light movements through this teeming, burgeoning city, my victims surrounding me, seducing me, inviting me to their supper tables, their carriages, their brothels. I lingered only a short while, long enough to take what I must have, soothed in my great melancholy that the town gave me an endless train of magnificent strangers. For that was it. I fed on strangers. I drew only close enough to see the pulsing beauty, the unique expression, the new and passionate voice, then killed before those feelings of revulsion could be aroused in me, the fear, the sorrow. Claudia and Lestat might hunt and seduce, stay long in the company of the doomed victim, enjoying the splendid humor in his unwitting friendship with death, but I still could not bear it. And so to me, the swelling population was a mercy, a forest in which I was lost, unable to stop myself, whirling too fast for thought or pain, accepting again and again the invitation to death rather than extending it. We lived meantime in one of my new Spanish townhouses in the Rue Royale, a long, lavish upstairs flat above a shop I rented to a tailor, a hidden garden court behind us, a wall secure against the street, with fitted wooden shutters and a barred carriage door, a place of far greater luxury and security than Point du Lac. Our servants were free people of colour, who left us to solitude before dawn for their own homes, and Lestat bought the very latest imports from France and Spain, crystal chandeliers and oriental carpets, silk screens with painted birds of paradise, canaries singing in great domed golden cages, and delicate marble Grecian gods and beautifully painted Chinese vases. I did not need the luxury any more than I had needed it before, but I found myself enthralled with the new flood of art and craft and design, could stare at the intricate pattern of the carpets for hours, or watch the gleam of the lamplight change the somber colours of a Dutch painting. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. Alright, so what's going on in that section? And I think obviously the first thing we have to talk about in that regard is the detail that takes up most of those 10 pages, which is the turning of Claudia into a vampire by Lestat. In terms of motive, the section kind of goes a bit iffy on the motive to try and make it look like this isn't just a direct attempt by Lestat to gain leverage over Louis. But even then, it does definitely conclude that the main motive of Lestat's turning of Claudia into a vampire is a way to convince Louis to stay with him, essentially, to, use this typical abusive tactic and assist in his possession. Because obviously, as we've observed a number of times before, Lestat is driven by possession and obsession and domination. And we're seeing that here because he's using this to possess Louis better, but he's also getting a new victim to possess in Claudia. This is even more supported by the fact that Claudia falls out of really the typical category of victim for turning that we see with Lestat. Lestat definitely seems to prefer turning young men within this novel. He does it to Louis, and he does it to an artist later on, and he definitely always turns about young men in terms of his desire to turn them into a vampire. But Claudia falls out of this category, and it just further evidences his motive of this as being a way to get to Louis. He's trying to get into Louis's head, and he's trying to break him, essentially, so that he will be easier to mold and manipulate and bring over to his view of the world. It is an archetypal abuser strategy. You don't even have to do much effort to put this in abusive context, because Lestat himself literally frames it as this kind of vampire family relationship, where Lestat is taking this child and using threat of violence against this child in order to further abuse Louis and keep him to stay in this situation of trauma and abuse. And it's true, the turning of Claudia is probably one of the most evil acts in this novel. There's a lot of really despicable things that Lestat does, but I think the turning of Claudia is the only thing that even the sequels don't try to justify, because the later books definitely do a lot of recharacterization, where they go back and they kind of retcon things to make things seem like they didn't actually happen the way Louis describes them. But even this instance, the sequels don't really find a way to justify. The sequels are very, very different books. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I just mean it's not the same as Interview with the Vampire. But even they can't find a way to justify this act. It's just so despicable, really. And one of the things we're going to see going forward, because obviously Claudia is now essentially a main character. She's going to be featuring for most of the book. And I'm going to try and pay her a lot of attention because there's a lot of stuff to talk to in regards to her. But in regards to moral standards, we're obviously never going to be able to hold Claudia to the same moral standard as any of the other vampires, because she never had a chance to develop this mortal view of the world, this moral framework that Louis would have, and that's holding Louis back in Lestat's view. And this makes it even more despicable, because essentially what this allows, and what I think a part of the motive can be found in it, is obviously he wants leverage over Louis, but also Claudia is an even easier target for Lestat to abuse and manipulate and possess, or at least so it seems at first, because as a child, she hasn't had the opportunity to develop a moral compass, and therefore he can kind of groom her into whatever moral entity he desires. And this grooming is intended to serve the purpose of making her his kind of ideal vampiric slave. And there's many, many parallels, I think, between Lestat's possession of Claudia and grooming, pedophilic grooming. Because the sexual connotations of feeding in this regard, and what we've seen them consistently throughout the novel, throws a whole spanner of nauseous discomfort into the entire situation surrounding the adult male vampires and their relationships with this 5-year-old child. Louis's relationship in particular is very, very unsettling. Because the language he refers to her in and the way he thinks of her swings between parental love and sexual love throughout the text. And that is, of course, accompanied by her, quote-unquote, mentally getting older. But it still highlights the monstrosity of this action and the questionable motives within it. It's really horrible. And I don't think that the relationship can be so easily summarized in terms of love. And this love is complicated quite thoroughly by the fact that she is trapped in her childlike state. Because there are many parallels in this text between Claudia and a doll. This notion that she will be in this childlike state, kind of perfect and porcelain and unchanged forever. There are better places to talk about this in specific regards, but for now, let's just keep in mind that this unchanging state allows her to effectively become an idealized virginal female form, where she will be permanently unmarred by the concept of a developed sexuality, and therefore she can remain permanently idealized in the male gaze of Louis and Lestat. It's all very, very unsettling and very iffy to talk around, because there is a great deal of depth to the character of Claudia, but part of what just, I guess, makes her really interesting in how creepy she is there's no real way to get into this notion of them being in love with her without dealing with the inherent sexual undertones that come with that. And you can really see why the other vampires in this text are very unhappy that she exists, because I think anyone would be very unhappy that she exists. It's really, really horrible. But anyway, there's loads of stuff to talk about with Claudia, and we'll get to that as it comes up. What else do we see in this section? One of the things we see towards the end is that Louis gives up on his notion of killing animals, and he begins to kill humans. He doesn't take the same attitude of, befriending and seducing the humans that Lestat and his new protege Claudia take on, but he sort of kills them indiscriminately, using his quote-unquote detachment as justification for it. This is just, I suppose, evidence of the fact that it's an indication of the fact that Lestat is getting to him. Lestat's consistent abuse, belittlement, and kind of moral confusion, it's wearing away at Louis. His armor is starting to chink, and Louis himself is starting to show the lack of efficacy of this detachment, and the only natural conclusion of this detachment that he surrounded himself with, where when he pretends that he doesn't actually care about anything, and when he pretends that he has no moral responsibility for his actions, which is fundamentally what he's doing, then that is only going to end up in him performing more and more immoral actions as he becomes more and more willing to compromise on his beliefs. And we're seeing that happen here as he begins to feed more and more off of humans. Obviously, this is probably about the 100th time I've explained that Louis' notion of detachment is morally nonsensical, and the notion of morality not existing is equally pointless. Because yes, sure, objective morality might not exist. That isn't a free license to be an asshole. Anyway, that out of the way. Final thing I want to talk about from this section relates to money. Because Louis has that whole point where he explains that money doesn't really matter to him, but he still kept all of his money. And obviously, I think this is nonsensical. Money is still really important to both Louis and Lestat. they are showing themselves time and time again to be capitalistic predators. Louis himself even has that great line where he says that, Lestat convinced me to kill a child, but he couldn't convince me to sign over his own, my property. It just indicates how ingrained into their psyche this capitalistic possessive instinct is to them. As much as they constantly go on, Louis constantly goes on saying he doesn't care about money, it doesn't matter to him, and yet his entire existence is financed by lavish wealth. They live in hotels, they can take boats whenever they want, which becomes important later. They go to places in carriages, they attend balls, they mingle in high society. Their entire predatory lifestyle is defined by their wealth, and their survival is greatly aided by that wealth, and they are constantly in the game of acquiring more and more wealth, because as we've seen with the tactic of killing wealthy people and investing their money, essentially. With Claudia, you'll remember I said to keep in mind that Claudia came from a poor background. Claudia comes from this poor background of nothing, and yet immediately, the second she's embraced into vampirism, she adopts this capitalistic monstrosity in the same manner that Louis and Lestat act upon it. And this would seem to kind of, at first, maybe contradict the notion of vampires as capitalistic monsters, because Claudia comes from outside that background. But I think at the end of the day, the exception ends up proving the rule. Because what you can see in Claudia is kind of this loose parallel to examples, examples that always get held up of really poor people, quote unquote, pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and becoming rich in really, really disparately wealthy capitalist systems. Usually America loves to talk about this. And what that ends up proving, in fact, is not that the system is really great and anyone can, achieve this. What it ends up proving is that the system is terrible and only one in every few 100,000 people will be able to do this, no matter how hard they work. Consider that Claudia got, quote-unquote, elevated to vampirism, whilst all the other children in that orphanage are basically just doomed to eventually either die or become vampire food. It's capitalistic monstrosity is kind of what the vampires are representing in this context. But yeah, loads more to talk about that as the text progresses, but I think that's where we'll leave it for today. That was a good section, so we'll come back tomorrow and we'll get to see a little bit more.